Good day, everyone. So, today I will be talking about subjective response theory and psychological response theory, still under reader response criticism. Before we proceed to the main discussion, let us first have a review about reader response criticism. As we all know, it focuses on finding meaning in reading. Next, it examines the ways in which individual readers experience the text. The third is these critics raise theoretical questions regarding how the reader joins with the author to help the text mean. Next, they determine what kind of reader or what community of readers the work implies and helps to create. Lastly, they also may examine the significance of the series of interpretations which the reader undergoes in the reading process. So when we say reader's response criticism, it focuses on the meaning and the texts in which on how the readers relate them to their experiences. Now let's have subjective reader response theory. For subjective reader response critics, led by the work of David Blake, readers' responses are the text, both in the sense that there is no literary text beyond the meanings created by readers' interpretations, and in the sense that the text the critic analyzes is not the literary work, but the written responses of the readers. So in here, when we say subjective, we are referring to the written responses of the readers according to what they have just read. And also, it does not mean that when it is subjective, we are only referring to the thoughts of the readers, but we are referring to on how they could relate to a certain literary text or piece. With that, David Blake differentiates the real objects and symbolic objects, wherein for real objects, we are referring to physical objects such as tables, chairs, cars, books, and the like. The printed pages of a literary text are also real objects. So what are symbolic objects? Well, the experience created when someone reads those printed pages or the real objects that I have mentioned, and also like the language itself, is a symbolic object because it occurs not in the physical world but in the conceptual world that is in the mind of the readers. So symbolic objects are related with our imagination upon reading a certain text, on how we interpret them in our mind before creating our responses through written forms. Upon differentiating real objects from symbolic objects, David Blake came to the idea of defining some terms like reading and symbolization, wherein he said that reading are the feelings, associations, and memories that occur as we react subjectively to the printed words on the page, while symbolization pertains to our perception and identification of our reading experience that create a conceptual or symbolic world in our mind as we read. So therefore, when we interpret the meaning of the text, we are actually interpreting the meaning of our own symbolization, wherein we are interpreting the meaning of the conceptual experience we created in response to the text. David Blake thus calls the act of interpretation as resymbolization, wherein resymbolization occurs when our experience of the text produces in us a desire for explanation. Our evaluation of the text's quality is also an act of resymbolization. Example, we don't like or dislike a text, or we like or dislike our symbolization of it. And then thus the text we talk about isn't really the text on the page, but it is the text in our mind, because the only text is the text in the mind of the reader. This is the text analyzed by subjective reader response critics, for whom the text is equated with the written responses of the readers. In addition, David Blake, whose primary interest is pedagogical, offers us a method for teaching students how to use the responses to learn about literature, or more accurately, to learn about literary response. Now, for contrary to popular opinion, subjective criticism isn't an anything goes free for all. It's a coherent, purposeful methodology for helping our students and ourselves produce knowledge about the experience of reading. Now, let's proceed to psychological reader response theory. Psychoanalytic critic Norman Holland also believes that readers' motives strongly influence how they read. He believes that reading involves a transaction between the reader and a real text. Holland focuses on what readers' interpretations reveal about themselves, not about the text. Holland says that we react to literary texts with the same psychological responses we bring to events in our daily lives. The situations that cause these defenses to emerge in our interpersonal life will cause our defenses to emerge when we read. Now, David Holland's idea has also something to do with the interpretation, wherein the goal of the immediate goal of interpretation, like the immediate psychological goal of our daily lives, is to fulfill our psychological needs and desires. And when we perceive a textual threat to our psychological equilibrium, we must interpret the text in some way that will restore that equilibrium. Imagine, for example, two readers who, at some point in their lives, have felt victimized or perhaps picked on by siblings, rejected by peers, or neglected by a parent for reasons beyond their control. So these readers' defenses probably would be raised by the character of Piccola in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye in 1970, because they would perceive her as a victim as they themselves have been. In other words, reading about Piccola would probably remind them of their own painful childhood isolation. For those who do not know about the story of The Bluest Eye, its core is a story about the oppression of women. The novel's women not only suffer the horrors of racial oppression, but also the tyranny and violation brought upon them by the men in their lives. The novel depicts several phases of a woman's development into womanhood. And I have also read that Piccola lived in Great Depression. So now, the first reader might cope with this textual threat by interpreting the novel in a way that condemns Piccola instead of the characters who torment her. For example, Piccola instigates her own victimization by behaving in such a passive manner and refusing to stand up for herself. In this way, the reader identifies with the aggressor rather than the victim and temporarily relieves his own psychological pain. Now, the second reader, for whom victimized characters threaten to stimulate painful childhood memories, might cope with Piccola by minimizing the character's suffering, focusing instead on some positive quality Piccola retains intact. For example, Piccola is the only character in the novel who never hurts anyone, and she will remain forever in a state of childlike innocence. This reader denies Piccola's psychological pain in order to deny her own. Other readers upon whom victim figures have a personal psychological impact would have to cope with Piccola too, and they would do so in the same way they cope with their relationships to victimization of their own lives. To use a simple example, if I am quick to dislike new acquaintances who remind me of my alcoholic father, then I probably be quick to dislike any fictional character who reminds me of him. My defense in this situation might be to dislike the text, misunderstand it, or stop reading it altogether, given that virtually all literary texts will in some way arouse my defenses by tapping some unconscious fear or forbidden desire. And I must have a way to cope with texts if I am going to read them at all. Now, according to Holland, that coping process is interpretation. Now, Holland calls the pattern of our psychological conflicts and coping strategies our identity theme. He believes that in our daily lives, we project that identity theme onto every situation we encounter and thus perceive the world through the lens of our psychological experience. So in here, when we read literature, we project our identity theme or variations of it onto the text. Therefore, our interpretations are products of the fears, defenses, needs, and desires we project onto the text. And interpretation is thus primarily a psychological process rather than an intellectual one. A literary interpretation may or may not reveal the meaning of the text, but to a discerning eye, it always reveals the psychology of the reader. Now, here is Holland's definition of interpretation. The first one is, in the defense mode, our psychological defenses are raised by the text. For example, going back to The Bluest Eye or the character of Piccola. We find Piccola threatening because she reminds us of our own experience of victimization. Next, in the fantasy mode, we find a way to interpret the text that will tranquilize those defenses and thus fulfill our desire to be protected from threats to our psychological equilibrium. So again, about Piccola, we minimize her pain by focusing on the childlike innocence that will remain forever hers. That is our way of protecting our psychological equilibrium from threats that we may encounter upon reading the story of Piccola. Lastly, for the transformation mode, we transform the first two steps into an abstract interpretation so that we can get the psychological satisfaction we desire without acknowledging to ourselves the anxiety-producing defenses and guilt-producing fantasies that underlie our assessment of the text. So again, for example, we decide that Piccola represents spiritual innocence. Thus, in the transformation mode, we focus on an intellectual interpretation of the text in order to avoid our own emotional response to it. And we ignore the fact that our intellectual interpretation grew out of our emotional response. So for here, let me leave the word silver lining wherein we decide that Piccola represents spiritual innocence knowing that she have experienced great depression, oppression, and even violation of her rights and tyranny. So we tend not to be empathetic about her situation because we avoid our emotional response to it. And also we are doing that to avoid we call this feeling of hurt because of her situation, because we might only remember the painful experiences we had in the past. So that is all for my report. Again, I am Mark Armanuel Torres, and thank you for listening.